Hi, Marty. Welcome with MSNBC.com. And you've mentioned several times this stove-type nature of regulation, which I think has encouraged sort of the regulatory arbitrage process of Wall Street, where they create securities and specifically look for, well, where's how can we really get this out of the tougher regulators and maybe get it onto 50 state regulatory bodies, or an agency that'll be perhaps less tough. And I'm wondering if I'm hearing you say that you support a broader umbrella type approach to regulation, where maybe you have a super regulator, either the Fed or perhaps a new body that's created.
I actually don't support a super regulator for this reason. I think it's valuable to have a systemic risk regulator at the highest levels that's monitoring risks across the system, but I actually think the presence of expert functional regulators is really critical. Without that, I think some of the things that work the best in our markets will really be hindered. So I recognize that regulatory arbitrage is a problem. It's clearly been a problem in the last several years. We need to eliminate that arbitrage. I'm not a fan of voluntary regulation. I'm not a fan of voluntary federal charters and things like that for different kinds of financial institutions, because I think there is a tendency to go to the least regulated space when you have that option. But I don't think a single FSA, as they have in the UK, type of regulator makes sense for us, because our markets aren't homogeneous, and we aren't a largely institutional marketplace, for example, the way they are in the UK. We need an SEC that protects investors, that has responsibility for independent setting of accounting standards, it has responsibility for corporate disclosure, without also worrying, frankly, about the safety and soundness of a banking institution. I think there are a lot of conflicts that are created when they're all melded together, and I think we're seeing some of those, frankly, play out currently. So I think the individual functional regulators, I can't tell you we need all the ones we have, but individual functional regulators under the umbrella of a systemic risk regulator is a model that I think would work best.
So is the Fed that systemic risk regulator?
I think that probably remains to be seen. I think there are conflicts for the Fed with respect to its monetary policy and other functions, and those are issues that need to be examined very, very carefully, because we have perhaps a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity here to reorganize the regulatory structure in a way that works for us and for our markets. I would hate to do it so hastily that by fixing one problem, we've now created a whole new series of problems. So the details are terribly important in this context, and we really need to work them through thoughtfully. We need to play out the unintended consequences of any proposed change right to the bitter end.
Hi, Suzanne Craig with the Wall Street Journal. Mary, I just wanted to talk to you about something and kind of get your broad impression. And from where the Journal is and where we've watched the SEC over the past 4 or 5 years, and when you were at FINRA, there was an impression that things had gone more towards a rules-based and regulation rather than enforcement. And that was supported in a lot of the reduction in enforcement cases that were brought. And I'm just curious, I'm heartened to hear sort of a lot of the initiatives that you're taking on the enforcement side now, but I'm just curious sort of, about your view of that shift, and also just how the last few years has changed, the credit crisis has changed the way that you view Wall Street. And secondly, I'd also just like to get your quick take just in terms of the Fed and how the move from like Goldman and Morgan to bank holding companies rather than brokers changes both the SEC role and whether or not the Fed's equipped to handle sort of the oversight and how you think they're doing.
Great series of questions. I hope I can remember at least some of them. Look, I think enforcement is essential. The rules are important. There's no doubt about it. We have gaps in the regulatory program that have been exposed by problems like Madoff and the Reserve Fund breaking the buck. And so we must be willing to fill those gaps, and we must be willing to take whatever regulatory action is necessary there. But frankly, the rules are pretty meaningless if there's no true threat of enforcement action. Because, I mean, we all know this from our lives, from our children, from our siblings, that if there's never a sanction for not following the rules over time, even the best intentioned people tend to think the rules don't really apply anymore. So we absolutely must have a renewed emphasis on enforcement. We have to preserve due process. We have to be careful and thoughtful about the cases we bring because they have tremendous impact on people's lives and their businesses, and we should never, ever take it lightly. But we absolutely have to be willing to back up the regulatory program with enforcement, or over time it becomes quite meaningless. So that's why we have a new director, that's why we have new tools, that's why we have new resources going to enforcement. We did, Congress was generous to us, perhaps not as generous as we would love to have them be, but Congress and the administration both in the upcoming budgets, significant portions of any increases we get will go to enforcement. But we have to be willing to kind of put our money where our mouth is when it comes to backing up our regulations.
Do you think FINRA could have been tougher under your administration? I'm just sort of curious how you see it in hindsight in terms of your first emphasis when you came in as the head of FINRA more towards, I think regulation rather than. Yeah,
there's no doubt that we can always have been tougher. I will say that for FINRA, and I can't speak to the SEC caseload, a lot of the large drop in enforcement cases, which was really a return to the norm, actually, because we'd had some years of very high numbers of enforcement cases and sanctions, had to do with a lot of very major initiatives working their way, sort of the pig through the python kind of process, whether it was breakpoints, late trading, market timing, research analysts, investment banker conflicts of interest, some very, very major initiatives. That said, sure, I think there's always an opportunity to do more, to be tougher, and to be more aggressive. And I think the entire regulatory regime, of which I was a part, probably was not as rigorous in the last couple of years as it could have been. Some of it, I think, really does go to our not malevolence or negligence even on our part, but a failure to connect the dots and understand the problems that were brewing beneath the surface as clearly as, in hindsight, I wish we all had been. And I think it's probably true across the regulatory community in the U.S., and frankly, I think it's true across the regulatory community around the world. I've forgotten all your other questions.
I was going to ask you on the bank holding company, but I'll let you on.